Welcome to the seminar series. I'm very excited today to welcome Dr. Hyland. He's actually a good friend of mine who's a graduate school with my husband up at the University of Michigan with a PhD in geology there. He's now a new professor at NC State studying climatology. He has also done a postdoc at the University of Washington. And today he's going to talk to us about how he can use science about past climate, understanding past climate to inform our current understanding of climate change. So we'll do a talk for about 45 minutes and have a little time for questions, and then we'll do a happy hour for those who are interested afterwards. Let's give a hand to our speaker.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you all for coming. I hope I'm glad enough for everybody here and folks that are watching. Yeah, so I'm a new professor at NC State. I work in the Marine Earth and Atmospheric Sciences Department. So some overlap with folks here. But the focus of my research is mostly on climate change in the past and the impacts of climate change on past ecology as well. So that was why I'm here today to talk to you guys about some of that. In particular, I wanted to talk about the projects that I am working on that really have relevance to modern climate change. And in terms of thinking about how we respond to modern climate change and how we adapt to ecological problems that may arise. So here's just a quick overview of my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of methods that I'm talking about when I say paleoclimate, paleoecology methods. I'm going to talk about what I mean when I say paleo, because for different people that means different things. For a lot of ecologists, that may mean human timescales. For a lot of geologists, that means Earth-type timescales. So I'll try to bridge that for you. And then I'm going to talk about a few different cases on different timescales and on different subjects. I'll talk about climate seasonality, I'll talk about grasslands, and I'll talk about some more recent ecosystem restoration using paleoecology information and how that pertains to some of the ways that we can think about modern climate change and modern climate policy. And then I'll introduce my lab at the end, so you guys can get an idea of what kind of work is going on just down the street at the state, in case you ever want to come over and use some of our cool toys. So I start out with this picture here, or with these pair of pictures here. This is actually sort of an example of the first case I'll talk about, Eocene seasonality. But I like to start out with it because it's a really stark example of ecological change, or paleoecology in particular. This top picture, or top artist rendition, is an artist drawing of the Canadian Arctic during the Eocene, so during a global warming period in the past. You can see we have tropical trees, we have the North American equivalent of a hippo from 50 million years ago, hanging out in the Canadian Arctic. This is what the same island looks like today. You can tell there's almost no vegetation, there's almost no living things. This is a giant ice sheet. So the ecology, the ecosystems on this island have changed extremely. Obviously, this is a very long time scale. This is 50 million years of change here. So an extreme change is maybe not so shocking, but I'm going to tell you about this and what some of the information we can gather from this time period can tell us about modern and future change. And some other similar stories where the change is not quite as stark. So I'm going to start out, obviously the reason that we care about this is climate change. So that is really the main thrust of things that I work on related to climate change and particularly related to modern climate change. Despite what the media or the president may tell us, climate change is a thing and is happening. And we can see that through observational data on human timescales, right? And we can see that on a global scale as well. We can see that there are that while climate change may be variable, this is one of the reasons that the term global warming has gone out of vogue. That it is a variable process, but globally we are warming, right? Climate change is a thing, and it's something that we have to think about in terms of our own infrastructure, our own human society, but also in terms of global ecology and the resource systems that we rely on. So that's really kind of the main motivation behind any of this work, is trying to think about what this means for people and for our broader scale global ecosystem. So when we talk about paleoclimate data, when we talk about paleoecology data, none of this stuff, so I guess let me back up and say, in the modern, when we're doing ecological work, when we're thinking about ecology, in a lot of cases, we can go out and make measurements and make observations of ecology, of the types of processes that we want to think about. We can go out and measure, forest assemblages. We can measure, we can go out and see how vegetation is changing or how organisms are migrating. In the past, we can't really do that. We can't go out and actually find something that will tell us about those types of processes. So what we have to do is we have to use geologic archives. And those geologic archives can take a lot of forms. Ones that are commonly thought about or commonly talked about are things like ice cores, the things that people have thought about. The problem with ice cores is that ice cores only exist for about the past 1,000,000 years. And so any information we have about climate or ecology before that is based on a rock, essentially. And so most of my research involves looking at those rocks, looking at those sediments, and trying to pull apart what aspects of those, whether it's physical properties or geochemical properties of them, can actually give us information about these past ecosystems and past climates. And so one of the problems with this, or one of the historic problems with this, that is sort of demonstrated by this image here, is that the vast majority of our records of climate on Earth come from the ocean. The ocean makes up a lot of our planet, so that sort of makes sense. And it's useful in that the ocean is, on long time scales, a very homogeneous thing in a general sense that can give us information about large-scale trends in global climate and global ecology. That's useful. And we can see here that in a lot of places, we can actually map that data. So each of these points, each of these circles, is proxy data, is that record from a geologic record of past climate. The colors behind it that you see are a model projection of the same time period. You can see that in many cases, they agree pretty well. In some cases, not so much. So what this can tell us is it can tell us about global processes, and it can tell us about what parts of the global system we might not quite understand, or we might be having issues with. Whether that is in terms of how we build our models, or whether that's in terms of how we collect data, how we collect past data. As I mentioned, most of our data comes from the ocean. You can see that in this projection. You can see that in this projection as well. This is from a time period that I study in the Paleocene. And you can notice that most of the dots here showing where we have data collected from, almost all of them are in ocean basins. Again, that's useful because it can tell us about global conditions like in this image. But one of the problems with that, well, there are two problems with that. One problem with that is that for the most part, we don't live in the ocean, right? We live on land. And so the ecosystems that we depend on and the climate variables that we depend on are not represented in a lot of these past records, and in a lot of, potentially, in a lot of our climate models that we're building to represent these areas. The second reason that this is important is represented here by some recent work by some collaborators of mine, where they are using state-of-the-art climate models to actually project what differences in temperature and precipitation will look like over the next 100 years. So this is temperature over on this side. You can see these are low temperature anomalies, high temperature anomalies. Same thing with precipitation, low or drops in precipitation, rises in precipitation. What you can see over here is that basically everywhere is warming. And you can see that the places that are warming the most significantly are over land. Right? And so that's the second reason that we care about terrestrial records or land-based records of climate in the past, is that in general, during periods of warming, during periods of extreme climate perturbations, land-based places experience it the worst. They have the hardest time. And so if what we're measuring in the past is changes in the ocean, we may not be seeing the full effects of what's going on when climate changes and what the impacts of that are on ecology. The other reason that land-based records are useful is that, for the most part, when we look at ocean records, we see a fair amount of homogeneity in those records. If we look at land-based records, we can actually see some pretty significant heterogeneity from region to region. And that makes sense because our modern climate over land has a lot of heterogeneity based on wind patterns, based on elevation, based on all kinds of different things. And we can see that in this record too, where we have a lot of heterogeneity over land in terms of changes in precipitation that happen over the next few years. And so having a record of this is useful to us because we can start to think about how this affects all of our systems on land, right? Because we might have differences in the southern US versus the northern US as a result of changes in temperature. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the rest of the talk. So the way that we actually collect these records, the way that we collect records of past climate on land is doing just this, what looks like playing in the dirt, but is actually collecting samples of sediment, samples where we can actually measure known ages and describe the depositional environments of those sediments in the past. So that gives us a very basic idea of what might be going on in that area. I can sit here, grab some of these samples and tell you that this red layer is a preserved soil, a soil that's 50 million years old. And I can tell you that this white layer beneath it is a preserved riverbed that's also 50 million years old. So we can get some information about the environment. We know that there was a soil. In this case, it had some particular features that we can see here, things like root traces. So this black line is actually a preserved root of a tree. We can see that it has clay, or it has burrowing animals, or it has buildups of calcium carbonate in the soils. So that can tell us something about the climate and the environment that we're in. We know that we have burrowing animals, we have roots, we have trees. So that tells us something about the climate. We're not looking at, desert sand dunes in this area, but we might not be able to tell a whole lot quantitatively just by looking at these things. We can get a qualitative idea of what's going on in the past by looking at these records, but we may not have quantitative measurements of climate parameters or climate information that we might care about. Because having a forest doesn't necessarily tell us what the climate was, right? You could look at a forest or a forest soil here in North Carolina, and it might look somewhat similar to a forest soil in British Columbia. But obviously, those are different climates. They might have different ecosystems. They might have different types of organisms and things like that going on. We wouldn't necessarily be able to tell just by looking at these chunks of carbon or being able to look at this, the sediments in the soils. So in terms of quantitative things that we can do with this information, one of the things that we can do is actually plot it right here. We can look at the geochemistry. We can actually look at the elemental chemistry of these soils, which tells us a little bit about them. Because if you've ever gone out and looked at either the physical properties or the chemistry of agricultural soils versus forest soils versus other kinds of things like that, you can actually tell a fair amount about your soils based on that. So we can use those things to tell us some about the environment. But we can actually use specific parts of these soils, specific parts of this environment, to tell us more information. A couple of those are these root traces, which preserve organic carbon. So that's a primary record of what's going on in the past. Same thing with these calcium carbonate or limestone nodules that you can find in soils as well. These are recording primary conditions at the time that this soil was forming. What we can do is we can use these complicated looking mass spectrometers, but we can use these to look at the isotopic compositions of these things. We can look at the isotopic composition of the organic carbon in those root traces. We can look at the isotopic composition of carbon, oxygen, and carbon dioxide, combined CO2 molecule in those carbonates, to give us information about the environments of those materials. And that's quantitative information that can be linked to modern records based on what we know about modern chemistry and modern physics of these isotopes in our modern system. So just as an example of that, we can look at the CO2. We can look at the carbonate molecule, and in particular the CO2 molecule, carbon dioxide, within this that forms in carbonate. The reason that we care about this molecule is this molecule is known as a clumped isotope. It's because all of these guys are measured simultaneously instead of separately. And the reason that we care about this molecule is that we can substitute in the heavier versions of carbon and oxygen into that structure. And that substitution relies almost exclusively on the temperature that carbonate is forming at. So if we can take that carbonate out of a soil, the soil temperature is representative of that environment, representative of mean atmospheric temperature in that area. We can actually use that carbonate and measure essentially the temperature of that environment, the temperature of that atmosphere, billions of years later, which gives us a really good archive of the climate conditions, or at least the temperature conditions of that place, even many millions of years later on. So this can give us information about things like temperature. The other good thing about it is that it has oxygen in it as well. So it can tell us not only about temperature, moving on a card here, but it can also tell us about the hydrosphere. It can tell us about precipitation. The carbon here can also tell us other things. We can use the relationship between carbon that gets buried in the soil and the atmosphere and the plants living on it to tell us a couple of things. They can tell us about the atmosphere, for one thing. They can tell us the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, which is useful for thinking about climate change, right? Because it can tell us the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature in the past. So if we think about if we think about climate sensitivity, or the term that we think of when we make predictions about how temperature will change as we continue to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, all of those calculations are actually based on these measurements, or measurements like this, where we're estimating the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the past, and also estimating the temperature of the atmosphere in the past at the same time. So that's how we make those measurements of climate sensitivity. That's one of the things that these carbon and oxygen isotopes can tell us. The other thing that the carbon isotopes can tell us is that they can tell us about the vegetation in that area in the past. Because different plants will fractionate carbon to different degrees as they incorporate it into their organic structures. So we can differentiate between certain types of grasses that differentiate much less than certain types of trees. So we can tell the difference between a grassland and a forest, or a mixed habitat. We can tell the difference between a rainforest, which actually fractionates even more, and a pine forest. And so we can get a lot of information, a lot of quantitative information, actually, based on the relationships that we see in modern environments, out of these seemingly fairly simple systems that we can measure isotopes in. So these are some of the major ways that we can get that quantitative information that we need to actually say something realistic, and say something meaningful about past climates and past environments. The other thing that we can use is something known as phytoliths. May not be a word that any of you have heard before, but You've probably heard of pollen records before, where we look at pollen in lake cores or pollen in marine cores to try to tell something about kind of the distribution of vegetation, or the types of vegetation that we might have had in the past in a given area. The problem with pollen is that it's organic, and when it gets buried, it doesn't survive very long. So for the most part, pollen records that we have are fairly recent. We can think about climate, or we can think about ecology on thousands of year timescales, or even tens and hundreds of thousands of year timescales with pollen. But once you get back into millions or tens of millions of years, it gets a little harder to use pollen because it tends to break down in these systems. Phytoliths are made of silica, so they don't break down. There's basically nothing or very few things in a geologic sense that break down silica, which is why we get such nice sandy beaches on the coast. Phytoliths are basically plants uptaking silica in groundwater and depositing that silica inside their cells. Most plants do it just because they uptake silica in their water and they don't have anything to do with it, so they stick it in cells that they don't care about. Some plants do it intentionally. I will get into that. But basically, what this does for us is that when these plants die and when their organic material falls apart, these little pieces of silica that are forming in their cells actually fall into the soil also. And they hang out there. They last much, much longer than the organic matter after it decays and decomposes. And they hang out in the soil. Each plant, luckily for us, has morphologically diagnostic and distinct silica bodies. So if we look at these, we can tell what tree they came from. And that's useful because if we look at a soil, or if we look at sediments that are buried in the past, we can pick out all the different shapes here and actually tell what that ecosystem may have looked like in the past, based on what the relative proportions of these guys are in the past. Some of these are very distinct. This comes from a palm tree, and you'll see this later. Other ones are maybe a little less so. These guys come from grasses. But we can actually distinguish different plants in our environments as well in a quantitative fashion using these. This is particularly useful in places that we don't have pollen or places that we don't have macrofossils, right? So in some places we get nice, beautifully preserved leaves, and we can pull them out and say, this is exactly what this plant was, and it's a great specimen, and we can measure all kinds of crazy things on it, like seeing what kind of insects it is. But that's very rare. In most places in the world, we don't have that, but we do have preserved sediment. And phytoliths are preserved in most types of sediment. We can get them in soils, we can get them in lakes, we can get them in marine cores. Basically, anywhere that you have sediment, we can probably find phytoliths if there were plants that we can find. So with all of these tools, we can start to think about climate in the past and ecology in the past. So I said that I would tell you about paleo timescales. This scale down here is a little bit stretched or compressed in different areas. But what we can see here, this is a record of global temperatures over the past 400 or 550 million years, or basically the part of Earth's history where we have macroscopic animals, things that have body parts, things that are multicellular, right? You can see over this time period, we have a wide variety of temperatures on our surface. If we're looking at the present, we're somewhere up in here, projected to go somewhere up in here. So compared to recent time, we're much warmer than anything that we've seen in any of this recent time. So if we look back thousands of years, we can look back hundreds of thousands of years, we can even look back millions of years, and we don't really get quite that warm. So we have really good records from ice cores. That's what's shown here in this first panel of climate, of what our ecosystems and climate look like over that time period. And they can tell us lots of things about Earth's climate history and what we might expect. But none of them make it up here. So we can't really tell what might happen in this range up here of warm periods, warm high CO2 time periods. we can look back a little farther and maybe get some other warm periods in here from other types of records, from ice cores or from sedimentary records. But basically, once we get beyond this line here, all of our records come from the methods that I just described. All of the records of climate over this whole span of Earth's history, and you can see that the scale changes here. This is 1 million years, this is 500 million years. All of those records come from the methods that I just described. And some of these ones do too, by the way. We can still use these methods in this more recent time period as well. But what I want to, I guess, stress to you, and sort of as an introduction to that first case study that I showed, that I'm going to talk about, in order to look at the climate system that we might see in the next 100 years, we have to go all the way back here. It's about 40 or 50 million years ago, to that time period where we had hippos and palm trees at the North Pole that I showed you at the very beginning. Okay, so we'll jump into that as well. This is another record that just shows that a shorter part of that time scale. So this is the present. This is about 65 million years ago. This is when dinosaurs disappeared from the world. Right here. This is the KT extinction. This period right back here, known as the early Eocene or the early Eocene climatic optimum, is the period before we had global ice sheets, before Antarctica had any ice, before the North Pole had any ice. So this is what we refer to as a greenhouse world. Okay, and this is the same kind of greenhouse that people talk about when they're talking about greenhouse gases, or when they're talking about the greenhouse world that we might be experiencing in the next hundreds to thousands of years, where there is limited or no ice at our poles. So since this period, we've transitioned into colder time periods. We've grown ice in our all over the world, and we have our modern ecosystem, our modern global environments, global climates, where we have ice in various places. I'm going to start out talking about this time period, then I'm going to move up here and then move even closer to the present. But basically, we're moving from a warm world to a cold world, climatically and ecologically. This is another zoom in on that time period, just to show you we have that warm period. We also have records of very high atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. So our current atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is about 400 parts per million. Pre-industrial is about 280. Back in the early Eocene, during that warm period, we had over 1,000 parts per million. So more than double even the modern. That's actually similar, this dashed line, or actually these two lines, are theoretical projections of where we could be if we continue to basically dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for the next couple hundred years. So this is a minimum amount, about 1,000, similar to the early Eocene. This is a maximum amount, almost 2,000, if we dump all of our carbon into the atmosphere. So you can see that this is sort of getting back to the range that we might expect over the coming centuries. And we can see that that is significantly warmer than modern environments based on great records. Now, if we think about some of the aspects of that, we care about, obviously, global warming. We care about the world being warmer. But most of the kind of catastrophic things that we think about when we think about climate change are due to seasonal changes in temperature and seasonal changes in precipitation. So seasonal temperature in particular. One of the concepts that people have suggested or thought about when thinking about these greenhouse periods is that in a warming world, if we warm up the world and we expand what we think of as our tropical ecosystems, then some of those characteristics of a tropical ecosystem might go with it. So one of the major characteristics of the tropics in our modern world is that there basically aren't seasons. And so if we're warming up the world and expanding our tropical ecosystems, could that mean that other parts of the world won't experience the same seasons? And therefore we might be sort of shielded from some of those real bad problems that we think about seasonal temperature, seasonal climate. And so people have used botanical records, used palm trees and hippos at the poles, for instance, to suggest that that might be true, that we might be safe from some of those problems. But the problem with that is that when we actually model the climate system, the way that we know that it works, the way that the physics of a rotating globe work, suggests that at mid-latitude and polar regions, that can't be true. You have to have seasons based on the way that our Earth works. And we've also discovered through some recent research that those botanical markers that we use for saying things were warm and didn't have much seasonality in the tropics are probably wrong. And so we have some new methods, one of which I just told you about, those clumped isotope methods, which allow us to estimate temperatures without caring about what the ecology is doing. Gives us a way of an independent way of measuring this temperature. If we look at this, so each of these different color groups is actually a different locality or a different site that's been measured with a bunch of different botanical proxies. What you notice in many of them is that the range of estimated temperatures from any given botanical proxy is huge. In some cases, it's 10 or more degrees Celsius, which is a big difference if we're talking about climate. That's the difference between, that's actually more than the difference between here and the equator in terms of mean climate. So that's a big deal. And so this might mean that those estimates saying that, you know, we have an equable climate, we're safe from extreme seasonality, might not be that reasonable. So what we can do in some places where we have the resources to do this, where we have the right materials to do this, we can actually estimate seasonal temperatures, not just mean temperatures. So mean temperatures are what we get from marine cores, for instance. It gives us an average temperature throughout the year because the materials that we're using form throughout the year. And so we can tell mean temperatures. But mean temperatures don't mean a whole lot on land or in a place that's seasonal, right? And so what we can do is we can use different archives that actually record different times of the year. So as I mentioned, those carbonate nodules that form in soils, they form during the summer, which means that the temperatures that we can measure from those clumped isotopes are summer temperatures. The plant material that we can also measure the isotopic composition of and use other types of methods on, primarily is their distribution is primarily controlled by wintertime temperatures, which can give us wintertime estimates. And the geochemistry or the chemistry of the soil is primarily similar to a marine record, controlled by the overall annual means. So because it's forming throughout the year. And so what we can do with that, with information from all three of those things in a single soil, we can actually estimate seasonality in the past. We can estimate what wintertime temperatures, mean temperatures, and summertime temperatures are in something that's 50 million years old. And what we find is that in the Eocene, our temperatures here in the mid-continent, and this is actually from a site in Wyoming, range from 0 degrees C to 35 degrees C. This is substantially warmer than modern temperatures in Wyoming, which range from about -10 to about +15. But in terms of the actual range of temperatures that we see here, it's actually almost exactly the same. Which suggests that even though seasonality may be variable, and even though the entire world may be warmer, the seasonal range that we can see might actually be similar to the modern. In some cases, when we have really extreme greenhouse events, like this peak EE scale that I mentioned before, the peak early Eocene, we might actually have increased seasonality and see that this kind of bumps up during that time period. That we actually get an expansion of that more extreme seasonal temperatures during the summer. So that suggests that not only are we not safe, that we might actually have increased problems with seasonality with summer seasonal temperatures with enhanced atmospheric CO2. We can also look at this with models. We've done some modeling of the Western US using low and high atmospheric CO2 concentrations. We can do this with modern models, looking at the same period except in the modern and over the next couple hundred years, using low emission scenarios and high emission scenarios. And what we see when we do that is that our proxy data, so that temperature measurements that we have from those soils, actually agree pretty well with the models. And the other thing that we can see is that the models also predict an increase in seasonality, particularly in the summer. So this is the current temperature, or mean temperature, or seasonal temperature in the western US. These are future models, these red ones, low and high CO2 scenarios. And these are Eocene models, low and high CO2 scenarios. So we can see here that in all seasons where we get warmer, but in the summertime, we get even more warmer. and that there seems to be some kind of atmospheric CO2 threshold for extreme summer seasonality. The reason that we care about this is that seasonality may actually play a pretty big role in climate change, as I mentioned before. These are some IPCC predictions of the next 100 years for precipitation intensity. The same is true for temperature seasonality. But the IPCC predicts that changes in seasonal temperature and precipitation may actually be the leading cause of losses, whether that's dollars or people, over the next 100 years, as a result of extreme seasonal droughts and flooding, heat waves, crop failures, stronger hurricanes, as we've seen recently, and changes in how invasive species can expand. So this is why temperature seasonality makes a difference, and this is why new information about past temperature seasonality during greenhouse periods where we have high CO2 is actually useful, because we can start to think about what kinds of things might happen in the future if we actually get enhanced seasonality as opposed to reduced seasonality. Okay, so the second project I want to tell you about has to do with grasslands. And the reason we care about grasslands is that grasses, in a broad sense, are most of our crops. Most of the things we eat are grass, right? Most of our sugar, all of our carbohydrates, basically, all of our wheat products, anything that's baked, comes from grass of some kind. I say grass as a broad word, but obviously that includes a lot of things, from corn to wheat to soybeans, any of those other things like that, right? In a general sense, grasses have been around for a long time. Dinosaurs ate grasses. In the sense of grasslands, which are what we think about when we think about the mid-continent US, what we think about when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa, or parts of it, what we think about when we think about lots of East Asia, where we get most of our agriculture from, are very recent. Grasslands didn't exist more than about 10 or maybe as much as 20 million years ago. So the vast majority of Earth's history, grasslands have not been an ecosystem that existed. And they are now a very significant ecosystem on Earth's surface. In some places, well, they vary, but in some places, they're 70, 80, 90% of the ecosystems on a given region. One of the problems with thinking about how these ecosystems respond to climate change is that we don't totally know why they became an ecosystem in the first place. Grasses were around for a long time, but grasslands happened much more recently. So there have been suggestions that it had to do with dropping CO2 because certain grasses perform better at low CO2. Could be increased fire frequency, could be aridity, could be changes in growing season climate. But we don't really know. So if we don't know how grass responds to changing climate, how can we predict what's going to happen to our crops? So we can look at this in the past. We can look at where grasses rise and how quickly they rise and where they become major ecosystems. This is an example from Montana. We can see increases in it. We can also see a stabilization towards the modern. And a lot of this change has to do with aridity in the region. And so we can suggest that aridity might be one of the things that really controls where grasslands are. We can do this with other types of data too. This is data from the last glacial maximum to the present, taken from bison and mammoth hair, which can estimate the amount of grasses in a given area based on what they eat. And what we can see is we can see changes from the last glacial maximum to the present in these isotope measurements and in modeled measurements. And what this can tell us is which aspects of climate are actually pushing the most on that distribution. And it turns out that when we do some modeling of these models and of this isotope data, that the major things that control where these grasses are, or the major thing, is growing season precipitation. So summer precipitation, seasonal precipitation. The second strongest thing is seasonal temperature. So seasonal precipitation and temperature basically control where all of our grasses and all of our, therefore, crops can be. So if we start thinking about this in the context of these projected changes in seasonal temperatures, in seasonal precipitation for the future, in growing seasons in particular, we can actually start to think about where grasses, where crops in particular, are actually going to win and lose, in the parlance of our president. But we can see here that in a lot of regions of the world, these changes in seasonal temperature, seasonal precipitation, have an extreme impact on the productivity of agriculture. We can see that in most regions, certainly in most tropical and subtropical regions, they're losing out. And this is primarily because they're losing out on precipitation during growing season. Some places see this and say, wahoo. So Canada, Europe, places like that are actually potentially going to see increases in productivity of their agricultural lands over the next 100 years. But the vast majority of the planet, in particular places with high population densities, are going to have problems. And so having information that can tell us about where these grasses are actually means something for predicting where we're going to have to do the most adapting to climate change in the future, in terms of our crop production, in terms of our agricultural choices that we make. Because this graph right here, this map here, is based on the assumption that we continue to plant, we continue to do agriculture the same way that we do now. Right? If we do that, you can see pretty clearly that we're not going to be able to feed all of the people that are on the planet, even the ones that are there now, never mind in 100 years. So this helps us to think about what kinds of adaptations, what kinds of different agricultural strategies, different planting strategies we can use to try and solve some of this problem. We probably can't mitigate all of it, but we can turn some of these reds into yellows or into greens by changing the way that we do things in terms of where we're planting things, how we're using irrigation in different times of year, which plants we're planting in certain climate regimes. So this is one of the ways that we can start to think about that. Okay, so before I run over time, I'll go through this last project quickly. This one I think is interesting because it's ecosystem restoration, and it's ecosystem restoration here in North Carolina. This is on a much more recent time scale. But in a very general sense, I'm sure you all know about ecosystem restoration in theory, returning places to their more natural functioning states. One of the problems with this is that restored ecosystems function better than degraded ones, but still underperform natural environments or underperform, in particular, in terms of ecosystem services, reference sites or ecosystems. One question is, can we do this better? And the second question is, why is this the case in the first place? So this project is actually looking at the North Carolina Piedmont. So the last few hundred years in North Carolina has seen widespread deforestation, expansion of agriculture, damming of waterways. If you've ever been down to Yates Mill in Raleigh. You've seen this one. These dams are all over the state. If you've ever been to Unstead State Park, this is what it looked like in 1900. See, that's a very different environment from today, right? And clearly a very different environment than it was originally, right? It was a couple hundred years ago. The problems that this has created are in the region are pretty severe. We have lots of erosion, lots of slope failures, houses falling into rivers, things like that. The biggest problem we have is poor water quality. 85% of rivers in this area are listed as basically unusable ecologically, which is a problem, obviously. And we also had these other problems with things like flooding and die-offs. Those are maybe less severe in this area. But these are all problems that we have, and they're all as a result of these degraded ecosystems in this area. There are a bunch of efforts being made to do restoration on the Piedmont. Some of the ways that people have decided to do restoration include things like dam removals. If we take that dam out, the river will be fine. In reality, that's not the case. We've also done a lot of forced channelization, where we basically force a stream to stay where it is so that it doesn't flood and doesn't erode the things around it by filling it with rocks or filling it with concrete on the bottom so that it's not going anywhere. Gotten rid of beavers because they dam things up. We don't want that. And we planted a lot of upland species like pine trees, like that, along our riverbanks to try and stabilize them. The problem with that is that recent research suggests that our problem may actually be getting worse. So this is water quality since a restoration on this river. See, the water quality has gotten way worse. The problem here is that in most cases, the thing that we're restoring it to is roughly a 1900s environment. And we saw what a 1900s environment looks like. It's not really what this environment was meant for, or what this environment kind of grew into, adapted to. And it's certainly not what that environment will hopefully adapt to in the future. So what we can do, or what we've done, is actually gone out and sampled a lot of plant assemblages, sampled a lot of rivers in this area, sampled modern soils. This is an example from Unstead State Park where you can see the erosion on this channel. This is what the slope would have looked like 100 years ago. So we've sampled all of these things in order to give us an idea of what this environment really looks like at a detailed scale in the modern. We've also gone out and sampled what this environment looks like in a very detailed sense in the past. So we actually have sections in Unstead and in other parks where we can actually measure, we can actually dig back down and see what these soils, what these environments looked like before they were colonized. So this down here is pre-colonization sediments. These are early colonization, late colonization, modern sediments. We can see that just by looking at them. You can see very, very distinct sections of sediment in these different parks. But we can also tell that because we've done radiocarbon dating on all of these sites. So we know exactly how old each of these layers is. And we know that these are pre-colonization, early colonization, late colonization, modern sites. So what we can do is we can look at that in a lot of different places. We can look at the pre-European settlement, those early legacy sediments, late legacy sediments, and modern sediments. And we've got ages for all of those things. And what we can see is we can see distinct changes in the sedimentology, in the way that these rivers are moving, the way that they're depositing their eroding sediment over this time period. We can see evidence of widespread burning. So these black slivers are charcoal. You can see evidence of that in these sediments. We can see a big change in erosion rates. It's a little bit cut off there. But the sedimentation rates in this area, in this part of Unstead, are 30 times faster during these agricultural periods than they are pre-European or than they are now. The other thing that we can see is we can see a distinct change in the ecosystems. So this is, the colors don't really matter, but they're basically different groups of plants that live there. So these blue ones are plants that are mostly found on the coastal plain, oaks, cypresses, longleaf pines, things like that. These green ones are ones that are found mostly in the Piedmont, so loblolly pines and things like that. Yellow ones are grasses or agricultural roots, and the black ones I told you are charcoal. But what we can see here is that we started out with a very different environment than we ended up with. even though this environment is a forest and this environment is a forest. Right? So Umstead State Park has been restored to a natural habitat. But it's not the habitat that it was before it was clear cut and turned into agricultural fields. Okay? So what that means is that restoration, true restoration, in the case of a lot of places around this area, and in particular in Umstead, means that these environments, that theoretically we would want these environments to return to when they were low-grade meandering streams instead of steep-cut river channels through most of the area. We'd want to see more wetland ecosystems where we can have cypresses, where we have beavers swimming around building dams, where we have waterlogged soils that would help with a lot of these ecosystem services, that we have a different composition of our forests, and that we would remove a lot of these legacy and landslide sediments that have been dumped into these rivers by mill dams, by agricultural practices, things like that. Here's another quick one, a related project that I'm working on in the South Pacific, the Palmyra Atoll out here, with the Nature Conservancy. As you can see, it's a pretty idyllic island. It's covered in palm trees. It's covered in this other plant, which is known as a fishkill tree. The interesting thing about this is that both of these plants are, I guess, maybe not food crops, but are used by native islanders. And it's suspected that they were brought there by native islanders, and that this island didn't naturally actually have these things. So that this environment looks nice and idyllic, but is probably not its natural state. And so what we're working on is actually looking at those phytoliths that I showed you to try and figure out whether these plants actually were there before Polynesians colonized this island. In a similar sense to thinking about how these environments looked in the past in this area. Okay. Okay. So I guess a couple of quick things that I want to leave you with here are that we can look at paleoecology, we can look at paleoclimate as great examples for ways that we can think about what to do in the modern. But the thing about the modern is that people are unusual, and the things that we've done to the planet are unusual. Okay? So what I want to show you here, this is a graph showing change in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations and changes in temperature. So you can see here, these are projections for the next couple hundred years, different emission scenarios. And what you can see is that the naturally occurring early Eocene climatic optimum that I showed you data from basically falls right on that line. It's basically a continued emissions projection for the next couple hundred years. Which is weird if we think about hippos or palm trees at the North Pole. But it actually is a pretty good analog. The way that it's not a good analog, and the way that some of the seasonality data that I showed you may not actually predict what might happen in the future, is this graph here, which shows the change in atmospheric carbon dioxide over time. So these are the rates that we're looking at. This is the amount of change that we've already done to the Earth. This is the amount of atmospheric CO2 that we put in. This is a future scenario if we keep going as usual. This is a future scenario based on what we assume will happen with continued industrialization. So realistically, we're probably somewhere in here. The rate of change for the early Eocene climatic optimum, this one up here where we got hippos in the North Pole, way down here. I had to make this line bigger so that you could see it. So the rate of change here is about 10,000 times slower than the rate of change that we see now. And so we may get to similar endpoints, but the rate that we're getting there is much faster. And so we don't know that our Earth systems, that our ecological systems, can make that same kind of transition. Can make that same kind of transition at that same rate. This is true when we think about the ecology more specifically too. We think about ecosystem vulnerability to climate change. You can see that basically the whole world is vulnerable. All of our ecosystems are vulnerable to some degree, some of them extremely, some of them less so, but still vulnerable to climate change. And one of the reasons that that rate question is important is when we start to think about how organisms, particularly sessile organisms like trees, respond to these changes in climate. So this is an example of migrations in Australia over the last 50 years of organisms of different ecozones in Australia. And what they found is that in a lot of cases, our climate regions or our climate conditions are actually migrating faster than sessile organisms can keep up. So obviously, if we think about the climatic ranges of trees and plants and things like that, our trees aren't pulling up their roots and scurrying a few miles north with the climate. But basically, the climate regions that they can actually propagate in are shifting. And so those plants can, to some degree, keep up with that. They can disperse a certain number of, at a certain distance, and actually their range can migrate with that. But not all organisms are going to be able to keep up with this. And the last one, I'll skip this kind of, but basically, when we're thinking about restoration in the way that I just talked about it, we have to not only think about restoration to more natural states, but we have to think about adaptive restoration, because the natural state that we're restoring things to might not be reasonable if our climate is changing. It's changing at such a rapid pace. So thinking not just about how to figure out what the problem is and design a way to fix it, but continuing to monitor it and actually continuing to adapt these restored ecosystems as climate and as ecological conditions continue to change, so that we maintain the functionality of the ecosystem without necessarily maintaining any given specific aspect of it. Okay. Yeah, so all of this data basically gives us ways to provide information directly and provide specific guidelines for making decisions about climate ecology in the future. But obviously it requires lots of work on the part of scientists and on the part of the public. So I hope what I've showed you is that these methods in paleoclimate and paleoecology can really give us lots of information about environments, and that this information actually has applications for modern climate, modern ecology, when we think about what we're going to do in the coming decades and centuries about climate change and about changing ecology as well. So with that, I'll just say this is our lab in North Carolina. If you're ever interested in any of the things I've talked about here, you're welcome to come over and check us out. We are happy to collaborate and run samples with folks as well. And there's just a smattering of other projects that I won't go into, but we work on developing method development, we work on other greenhouse climates, we work on paleoaltimetry, figuring out the topography and where mountains were growing in the past. We work on understanding primate habitats and how they change and migrate in the past. So we work on a bunch of other things. If you're interested in any of those things, feel free to ask questions or answer something.
We're a little over time, so we need to wrap up here. Who wants to go on for a few questions? Then let's go to happy hour after that. Keep your conversation going. Anyone have questions?
So,
Yeah.
what do you feel like the practical implications of your work on the unfed agricultural vegetation?
So we're still trying to work out exactly what that will look like. The eventual hope is that once we figure out, once we get a better sense of what this looks like on a regional scale, I just showed you a couple of sites, and that's all that we have data for so far. But once we think about this on a regional scale and start to work out what that looks like, we might actually be able to provide guidelines or provide recommendations to some of the groups, some of the companies that are actually doing restorations in various degraded habitats or in parts of the parks that they're trying to update. Potentially, but we'll we'll cross that bridge. Yeah, so the eventual goal is, yes, to be able to provide some kind of guidelines or recommendations for these groups that are trying to do restoration.
Question: are you finding, or are you, I guess, hypothesizing that the seasonality of precipitation, the sort of change in the seasonality, is going to be more significant than sort of the change in like total annual precipitation?
Depends on what you mean by change. In terms of the impact on things like crops, probably the seasonal precipitation means more, partially because they're growing only during the growing season, but also, but also because of things like irrigation. You know, the fact that we have low precipitation year round may mean less than during a certain season. But in a more broad sense, if we're thinking about natural ecosystems or the recharge of aquifers and things like that, obviously the total might matter more. So depending on which problems we're trying to think about and solve, maybe a different answer. Anything else?
First off, thank you for this. Second, in terms of the grasslands and studying, I'm trying to work my head around how do you incorporate settlements or kind of food facilities for maybe having a specific type of grass, and how do you just negotiate that when you're trying to model these things
Yeah, that's a good question. So all of the paleo data that I showed you would have been pre-agricultural, and so we don't have to care so much about what people are putting in there. But certainly in terms of projecting for the future, that's a big issue, and that is sort of what I meant when I was talking about having to adapt agriculture and adapt crops to the climate regimes that we have, because certainly, as you saw in that map, continuing to plant the things that we like or the things that we might want more of in those regions may not be a reasonable thing to do, and maybe we could continue to do it, but they're going to be significantly less productive than they used to be, and then other crops can be were to substitute. So yeah, that's certainly one of the difficulties and sticking points in adaptation is that inherently it requires you to change certain aspects of your life that maybe more or less define.
It's more of a asking opinion kind of thing, and I guess it has like policy and educational implications. But like, I learned about this carbon isotopic analysis and like how well the isotopes scale with temperature and also like different climate regimes. Just like 2 weeks ago, and I'm a graduate student, and it seems like a very basic idea in chemistry, and it doesn't take a lot. It's not very complicated. It's a very like fundamental governing, I guess, theory, like the theory of chemistry, and that involves like just the chemical physical properties of these things. Why are they teaching some high schools? Have you ever thought about like visiting high schools in North Carolina and just like, or as a guest teacher in like some chemistry class? So I feel like it would improve like also public literacy and trust in climate change predictions big time. You could hear that it's literally like it has to be carbon, and not just like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but like that we can measure in the body.
Yeah, so one of the things that I did when I was at the University of Washington was working with school groups and actually bringing them to our labs to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm actually working right now to develop a program with Wake County to do that in high schools in Wake County. And so we'll actually be bringing Wake County students into my lab and having them run samples and talk about how we actually make these measurements and what it means for past climate. So hopefully that will be a thing that we do more of. At least my lab group will be doing more of in the future.
Do your students and collaborators know summer? Then that is something, it just happened, this year's iteration just happened, or at least the triangle version, but they're not like satellite versions. It's basically like for researchers and educators and the researchers that would like that students in the lab come up with a lesson plan to then give to educators. So throughout the state, then educators would have access to this lesson plan. And they're like always looking for K through 12, they're looking for like especially like in the physical sciences too. I feel like they're not an absence of that.
Yeah, no, that would be great.
So it helps sort of the research get paired with educational standards so that you can actually get the science of the class and not take away from time.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Only moved here in January, so finding out about these new things is great.
So I have a pretty broad question that might hard for you to answer quickly, but so I work with coral skeletons. I don't do isotope work or anything, but I've read a lot of literature on sort of the most common isotopes that people use in coral work, typically the oxygen isotopes.
Yep.
And there are a lot of
recently pumped isotopes too.
Oh yeah. So, but there are also like new ones that people are sort of like exploring, like barium and strontium, calcium ratios and stuff.
Yep.
What's the process of like figuring out these new isotope temperature calibrations with like new elements? Is it something that you guys just sort of experiment with, or?
Yeah. So in most cases, it involves some combination of growing organisms in known temperatures and known compositions of water and things like that. And in others, it involves actually going out, sampling roots and sampling organisms around the world. And so yeah. I mean, it is just experimentation. Obviously it has a theoretical backing too. So we knew that clumped isotopes have a physical temperature response to begin with, and then we go out and do it in corals to see both to see that they do that and to see what vital effects there might be from coral growth or from temperature and pH and things like that of where they're growing and things like that. So yeah, but it is a lot of times it is just experimentation. Where can we apply this thing? Yeah.
All right. Well, so we're gonna head to happy hour. You can have to maybe. Oh, wait, I don't have girls in this.
How do you turn this on? Button on the move? That's pause. Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, that worked out. Thank you again so much. Thank you so much. I'm so interested in all of this in the undergrad.
Okay, yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering what kind of
yeah, so I certainly have lots of projects that folks can work on. So if you're interested in volunteering as an undergrad, and if you're interested in grad school also in the future, there are certainly opportunities in both of those places. So so, absolutely. Yeah.
My name's Kathy.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So I work in urban streams, usually. And so these are systems that historically have had these agricultural sediments, flushing into basins, and but then we see this pattern of the channelization from the flashier extreme flows from pervious surface cover. And so I was wondering if anybody, to your knowledge, or if you have data to do this, calculated if we just left alone, how many hundreds, thousands of years would it take to wash those sediments back out of the system, given the accelerated flows from the impervious surface cover development.
Yeah, so there has been some work done on that in some streams in Olmsted. It depends. It depends a lot on the stream and on the characteristics of the sediment. So in some of the, I guess the variability in streams that have been measured in Olmsted is anywhere from so basically your washout rates of sediment are anywhere between, I think it's like 30 and 500 times faster than natural systems, and so that's a huge range depending on the stream. So you could be looking at decades, you could be looking at thousands of years, depending on how your stream is configured and how much sediment there is in it and things like that. So, but that is certainly one of the major things that's impacting water quality in a lot of them.
Yeah, it's kind of double-edged sword because you want that sediment out if you're thinking about the water quality right there. If you're thinking about floating, then of course you want to retain that sediment. And so, the two sides to the beaver, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the, I guess, what our research is showing is that probably a lot of the streams tended to be more meandering, non-channelized streams, which I guess gives you both benefits in that you're not flashy and channelized and picking up a lot of that sediment, and you're basically keeping it where it is, and which theoretically improves the water quality and gets you out of the issue of having those flashy.
Yeah, from the forest standpoint, then you lose your lowland area unless you go in and physically remove the sediment to create floodplains again.
Yep. So it's certainly not an easy easy solution. Yeah. Yep. Definitely a complicated thing. We've changed the landscape so significantly that in many cases it's probably hard to go back.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm not going to happy hour. Okay. So I'm a grad student here in Carleton Students Lab. So we have about 200 full groups. Yeah. And right now we're
Erin's going out. I'm not her.
Oh yeah. Oh.
I know.
In the kitchen, and then I can exit bags. Yeah. So they were just watching their films, I think. But I can put plates away, and then if you wanna, put the salsa in the fridge and take this thing back to Brian. It goes to Brian.
Simon. No, Gavin Foster. It is. Okay, yeah. But anyways, I think you may be interested in having a collaboration getting closer if you're interested in
We're just getting a lab, set up and finished off right now. But definitely I'm happy to, run carbon oxygen pump isotopes.
pump isotopes.
Yeah, it's something that's new in corals. People start doing. So yeah, you guys are collaborating. Down the road.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Shoot me an email and we can figure something out. Yeah.
Yeah, so realistically, it's like not happening. If you want it as much as you want. You just not.
again, super interesting talk. Like, okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, but then I was like, I feel like this you might get upset. But do you guys get like Jurassic Park jokes all the time? I want to make a comment, but it's kind of like anthropologist and Laura Croft. Like you just don't say that.
No, it's fine. I'm a fan of Jurassic Park.
Okay. Because as you were talking, I was like,
yes,
I feel like I got like.
I've actually started public talks with pictures from Jurassic Park.
Have
before,
you really?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my god. But this was super, and I say it was so great because I'm in the social sciences, so I do more like environmental sociology. Yeah. This did not go over my head. Like that was like,
Good.
I was like,
I tried to make it accessible.
I'm following this. I'm feeling good about it.
Well, you can, I mean, like,
Okay.
you want to just like go to volleyball and it's not like
Yeah, no, I mean,
after.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so if everybody wants, it's fine.
Probably because people came to lunch and stuff, you know, like I'm talking about.
Yes, and I dragged it out.
You're tired. Oh,
I have been exhausted by reading. I don't even know.
just like take a self-care. I just yesterday I did zero work and I went to Whole Foods and spent $100 on like herbs and essential oils. Yeah.
I wanted to say that you're super good. I was being like,
Right? No, I told him, I was like here for this. Like I could get it, right?
Yeah, and like you're, you know, more of the social. Yeah, both the sciences and
Yeah.
I told him, I was like, I don't do this stuff at all. Like, I don't know.
That's good.
yeah,
It's so
it's very accessible. You time out your
Oh yes, it was 2 seconds away from being like, so where do I come from? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm good that it was engaging because I definitely put a few people to sleep in my reality on last week. So I gave a talk in the geology department last week.
They're in the wrong field. It was, I mean, and there was more stuff that's called focus, like specific to what I understand. Like, even so, you're a geologist, so you should not be bored with this. I would come out with you guys for years, but I've actually, I do a having smaller discussion on Thursday nights. And usually I have enough time between happy hour and like between the end of the talk and happy hour to like get there and after happy hour, but it's not like getting a huge round. Yeah, I will. Actually. No, I don't think so. Aaron, yeah, I'm not. Wait, are people? I feel like it was she at the bachelor party. Okay, I have not. So, I think we're doing a craft day on Sunday. I'm really hungry. Yeah, you should. We're going to Topsail Island because Charlie's grandparents. Well, there's sorry. It looks like it's not. It's warm enough. Honestly, it's the water's still like warmer. Yeah, the water's still warmer than the pond water here for swimming. It's just like at the end of October. Like Sunday, during peak like warm midsummer like pond temperatures, like it's so I'm really stressed. I was losing my mind. Yeah. I was. Yes. water heater thing. I can turn the system off. Yeah, I think so.
I better turn this off, you think, because we'll be upset about it. Let me see if I can. Wow, it's. Oh my God, is it?
Says recording in the corner.
So does this say end meeting? Is that what it says?